بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Continuing with this great book of Islam, the book of the Shifa by Qadi Iyad. So inshallah today we're going to begin with section 6. This is for those that have the book, page 300. Refutation of certain suspicions. So this is the section in which he's going to talk about what is commonly known as the satanic verses, which I think I made reference to in like the last class or the previous class, something like that. But this is where he's going to discuss it. This is a long section. We might not get through the whole one, because what he's going to do is deal with a couple of these stories that are commonly misinterpreted. So we'll take it as it comes, inshallah. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. So Qadi Iyad, he says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. Section 6, refutation of certain suspicions. In this section, we will deal with certain questions posed by calumniators, which is an odd word, but anyway. One of them is what is related about the Prophet ﷺ's recitation of Surah An-Najm, the star. It is said that he recited, have you really considered Al-Lat and Al-Uzza and Manat, the third, the other one, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاتَ الثَّالِثَةَ الْأُخْرَى, those sequence of verses. And then added, not the Prophet ﷺ, but then was added in this narration, those are the high soaring cranes whose intercession is hoped for. تِلْكَ الْغَرَانِيقُ الْعُلَى. So this is the satanic verses, that there is this narration that the Prophet ﷺ received revelation of Surah An-Najm, and then when he got to these verses, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, Al-Manat, he mentions these three idols that they worship. There was a sound, or so, it ends up becoming Satan. He interjects, oh, تِلْكَ الْغَرَانِيقُ الْعُلَى. These are the high soaring cranes whose intercession is hoped for. When the Prophet ﷺ finished the surah, he prostrated, and the Muslims prostrated, and so did the unbelievers, since they heard him praise their gods. Now, this story is important because this incident happened during the first hijrah to Abyssinia. So when the Prophet ﷺ when the Prophet ﷺ upon him was revealed the surah, and he narrated the surah to the people, at the end of Surah An-Najm there's a sajda. So everyone made sajda. So the people, a rumor spread that the people of Quraysh had accepted Islam. So the people, some of the Muslims in Abyssinia started to come back. And then they realized there was there's this miscommunication. So then they went back a second time to Abyssinia. So this is obviously highly problematic, right? Now, let me just say before we get into the text, there are two ways that the ulama have dealt with this. The majority of ulama who deal with this, and these are the ulama of hadith, they say that this tradition, this particular text, is completely dubious. There is no strong chain of transmission. It's a completely false narration. To the point that many of the ulama of hadith would prefer that it's not even recorded in the books and not mentioned in the books. It's a very, very weak, it's not even a weak tradition. There's breaks in the chain of transmission, that if there's a break in a transmission, that there's a narrator that's skipped, I mean, obviously you can't use it because anything could be made up. So some of my teachers maybe I mentioned this story to you, some of my teachers who are teachers of hadith, that's the opinion that they took. If I ever even mention the other way of dealing with it, they get very upset. They're like, no, this is completely weak, shouldn't even be discussed, so on and so forth. There's another way of dealing with the story, which is the way of the fuqaha, or the way of the usulis, which is to say, okay, let's assume that this story happened. Forget about it being weak or not. Let's just posit that it happened. It's weak, okay, we understand, but let's say it happened. What happened then if this narration occurred? And they say that it was shaitan who was with the group and added this pseudo verse. not the Prophet ﷺ. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ making a mistake in receiving revelation and conveying is impossible. We will all agree. I mean, that's what the whole point of this book is. Something like that is theologically impossible for us. There's no way him or any of the Anbiya ﷺ would make such a mistake. So therefore, that's obviously not the answer. The answer is not that the Prophet ﷺ became under a spell or was confused, or then he would not be Rasulullah ﷺ if that happened. That can happen to us, but it can't happen to Rasulullah ﷺ. So what the fuqaha take from this story, not paying attention if it's sound or if it's not sound, but all of us agree that it's not sound. Nobody says that this tradition is sound. Is they say there's a lesson in this story, which is what is preserved from the Prophet ﷺ is his physical appearance, not necessarily his voice. So this is part of the discussion that we have in fiqh on visions. What happens if you dream of the Prophet ﷺ, or you dream of a prophet, or you dream of a sahabi or a great scholar or saint? Is the vision a hujjah in the sharia? Is it a proof or not? So this is actually a discussion that you find in the books of usul al-fiqh. Can you take sharia from something the Prophet ﷺ tells you or not? Even more than that, there are those amongst the saints who meet with the Prophet ﷺ in a waking state, a yaqadha, not in a dream, but in a waking state. And it's very rare, but it can happen. If somebody were to be blessed with that they actually see the Prophet ﷺ next to them, and then the Prophet ﷺ tells them 1, 2, 3, 4. Can you take 1, 2, 3, 4? So they cite this story to show you that what is preserved is the physical appearance of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because he said, "Man ra'ani faqad ra'ani." Whoever sees me, he has indeed seen me. فَإِنَّ الشَّيْطَانَ لَا يَتَمَثَّلُ بِي. Because the Satan does not take my appearance. But he did not say, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what I say in the vision is preserved. And that's the point of this story. So there is a lesson in the story. Not that this story is important because it's dubious, but it reminds us of this lesson. That what is preserved is the vision of the Prophet ﷺ, not the speech of the Prophet ﷺ. So therefore, whatever he says has to be placed in the scales of the Sharia. So if somebody, let's say that this story happened and somebody was in that gathering and they heard what Shaitan said, they were next to Shaitan and the Prophet ﷺ was way over there, and they heard this and they got mixed up. That doesn't make sense. He's calling for Tawheed and then he's saying, these are the great cranes. Well, you have to place that in the scale of the Sharia. Now you can see from this elaborate discussion why the ulama of hadith would be like, just don't say that. Just stay away from that because it's just too messed up. You can say the same lesson, but in another way. You don't have to use this story. And I agree. And I think maybe I told you recently, in last October, I was in a dinner with two of my teachers. One teacher who taught me hadith and the other teacher who taught me usul al-fiqh. And I mentioned this story to my hadith teacher, and next to us was both of our shaykh of usul, and he whispers like, I wish Maulana never even mentioned the story. He was very upset that he even mentions it because that's his area is hadith. So you can see that there is always this tension between the different ways of dealing with this tradition. But nonetheless, we're stuck with the tradition. It's in our books, and that's why Qadi Iyad is dealing with it. Okay, so now let's return to see what he has to say. One of the transmissions says that Shaitan cast it on the Prophet's tongue while he was hoping for something to be sent down on him to bring his people near, which obviously is an impossibility. I mean, how can Shaitan have power over the Prophet ﷺ? Another version says he was hoping that nothing would be sent down on him which would alienate them. I mean, Shaitan can want what he wants. Doesn't concern us or the Prophet ﷺ. This story goes on to say that Jibreel then came down to him and the Prophet ﷺ recited the surah to him. When he reached the words, those sequence of verses, when he received these words, Jibreel said to him, I did not bring you these, meaning the false verse that Shaitan added. So this narration almost makes it seem that the Prophet ﷺ said that, which is an impossibility. So you can see why the scholars of hadith have a big problem with the story. The Prophet ﷺ was distressed because of this, and Allah Ta'ala sent down the following ayat to console him. We did not send any messenger or prophet before you without Shaitan insinuating something into his recitation while he was reciting. but Allah Ta'ala revokes whatever shaitan insinuates, and then Allah confirms His signs. Allah is all-knowing and all-wise. And also the verse in the Quran, they are really near to inviting you from some of what we have revealed to you, hoping you would intend something against us, then they would have taken you as their intimate. So this sequence or this narration would make us believe that the Prophet ﷺ accidentally recited these verses. He was upset when Jibreel told him, so Allah Ta'ala revealed another set of verses to console him, which obviously is then problematic because we negate completely that the Prophet ﷺ even said this to start out with. Know that we have two approaches for discussing this problem, the problems posed by this hadith. One approach considers its source to be weak, and the other considers it sound. As for the first approach, it is enough for you to know that this hadith is not related by any of the people of sound hadith, meaning in the 6 books of the sound 6 books of Sunni hadith, this hadith is not found in any of them. Nor does anyone reliable relate it with a sound direct chain of transmission. It is only commentators and historians who are fascinated by strange things, be they sound or faulty, that are fond of this kind of thing. In general, Muslim historians would include in their histories all sorts of things. Not because they, with respect to Qadi Iyad, not because they were fascinated with the odd things, but that's the job of the historian. The job of the historian is to catalog everything that's been written. The problem with that approach is that for people that read, if you can't discern, then you will start to assume that something is sound and something is not sound. But many of the historians, like Imam al-Tabari was a mujtahid, and he was one of the great mujtahids of Islam, and he has an entire history of Islam. So it's what you find in the history books, but when you include stuff like this, it can be problematic. That's why you have to have commentary and footnotes. Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-A'la al-Maliki spoke the truth when he said that people were put to the test by some sectarians and commentators, and the heretics continued to adhere to the story in spite of the weakness of its transmission, the disarray of the various versions of it, the gap in its chain of transmission, and the discrepancy in its words. So all of these are holes in that there are different narrations, they have different wordings, there's no sound chain of transmission, and then its meaning is completely contradictory to orthodox belief. One variant, one narration, one wording, says that it took place during the prayer, while another says that it was sent down on the Prophet ﷺ while he was summoning the people. Another says that he said it while he was sleepy. And in another says that he self spoke to him and made him forgetful. Another variant says that shaitan said it on his tongue, and when the Prophet ﷺ recited it, Jibreel said, "This is now how I recited it to you." Another says that shaitan told him that the Prophet ﷺ had recited it, and when the Prophet ﷺ heard it, he said, "By Allah, it was not sent down like that." All of these, now you can see, that's ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. It's highly, highly problematic. So I can see why people like Qadi Iyad are upset, who is a scholar of hadith, by the way. None of the commentators who relate this story, nor the followers, the tabi'een, give it a chain of transmission or trace it back to one of the companions. So its chain of transmission is maqtu'a, it's cut. It doesn't even go back far enough. The marfu' hadith is a hadith that goes to a companion. Contained it from Shu'bah, from Abu Bishr, from Sa'id ibn Jubayr, from Ibn Abbas, and he says, I imagine showing the doubtfulness of it that the Prophet ﷺ was in Mecca. Abu Bakr al-Bazzar says that this hadith is not known with a direct connected chain of transmission except through Shu'bah, and he was unsure about it. As for the implications, it has already been clearly shown, proof has been established, and the community is in agreement that the Prophet ﷺ was protected and free from things. So the first set of commentaries he's saying is that there's a problem with the hadith itself. And this is the case. The majority of the hadith scholars say that this transmission is completely dubious to be used. Now, Qadi Iyad is going to deal with the other implied things with this chain, with this story. As for the implications, the implications that shaitan had power over the Prophet ﷺ, or the Prophet ﷺ made a mistake or something like that, it has already been clearly shown, proof has been established, and the community is in agreement that the Prophet ﷺ was protected and free from things like this, both from any desire for something like this to be revealed to him, in which there is praise for the gods, other gods than Allah Ta'ala, which is disbelief, and also from shaitan being able to overcome him, and make the Quran obscure to him in such a way as to make him put in it what was not actually a part of it. It is not conceivable that the Prophet ﷺ should believe something which was not part of the Quran was part of it, so that Jibreel would have to inform him of it. All of this is impossible for the Prophet ﷺ. It is impossible for the Prophet ﷺ to have said this from himself intentionally. That would amount to either disbelief or forgetfulness, and he is protected from both of these things. It has been confirmed both by proofs and by consensus that the Prophet ﷺ is protected from any disbelief coming to his heart or onto his tongue, either intentionally or through forgetfulness, or that what the angel cast into him should resemble anything that shaitan casts, or that shaitan should have a way to get to him, or for him to forge lies against Allah Ta'ala intentionally, or through forgetfulness regarding something that had not been revealed to him. If you believe that, then the whole Quran and all of the hadith, everything would be called into doubt if shaitan could do something like that. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, if we had made up and any sayings, ascribed them to us, we would have seized him by force. Allah Ta'ala also says, then we would have let you taste a double punishment in life and double in death. You would not have found any helper against us. The second point to be made is the general impossibility of the story. If these words had been as they are related, it would have been incongruous, contradictory, mixing praise and censure, and feeble. That would not have been hidden from the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims and leaders of the idolaters who were with him. It is not concealed from the most insignificant person who reflects on it. So how could it have been hidden from the people who had great knowledge and were thoroughly versed in the science of eloquence and sound Arabic? Meaning, the pseudo phrase by shaitan, تِلْكَ الْغَرَانِيقُ الْعُلَى, its linguistic style is not the style of the Quran. Well, obviously, because it's not the Quran. So he's saying, and it even sounds incongruous. So if basic people can understand that, how about the Arabs at the time, which were naturally eloquent and fluent in the Arabic language? I mean, they would have, why would they be confused by something that doesn't make any sense? Like nobody, for example, nobody, whether from the idolaters of Quraysh or from the Sahaba or the believers, nobody confused what the Prophet ﷺ said himself with the Quran that he revealed. Right? There's no like second version of the Quran where, oh, this is the Quran of Ibn Abbas and he adds like something, and others are like, no, this is the hadith. No one does that because it's clearly different. The hadith is clearly different than the Quran. They don't even sound the same, obviously. So he's saying something similar. Well, if they can make that distinction, why couldn't they make the distinction here? Which is a very important sort of kind of response. And by the way, I know this might sound kind of, why are we talking about it? Well, it's in the book, but why is he spending so much time? Because there are traditions that we have that are problematic, and I want you to see that the ulama are not afraid to discuss these things that might seem to be problematic. The third point is that it is known that the habit of the hypocrites and the idolaters, those who are weak of heart and ignorant Muslims, was to bridle at the first opportunity. His enemies would use the slightest excuse to cause confusion about the Prophet ﷺ and abuse the Muslims. They gloated over them time after time. Those with a sickness in their hearts who had professed Islam abandoned it at the least doubt. However, in spite of this, no one related anything about this story other than the weak version that has already been mentioned. If the story had actually been true, Quraysh would definitely have used it to attack the Muslims, and the Jews would have used it as a proof against the Muslims, as in the haughtiness they used regarding the relationship of the night journey, which led to the apostasy of some Muslims who were weak. The same thing also happened in relation to the circumstances of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. In other words, what he's saying is the Quraysh, would be like a gift to Quraysh. If something like this actually happened, they would exploit it. And they did exploit other things, like they exploited the Isra and the Mi'raj, and they said, look, he's crazy. He said he went to Jerusalem last night and this and that, right? And they tried to use that, and then Allah Ta'ala supported him through revelation. And the Prophet ﷺ described it, so on and so forth. So he's saying, if this actually happened, why didn't the Quraysh exploit it? But they were trying to exploit anything and everything. The Jews tried to exploit. They would ask him difficult questions about the people of the cave, about the soul. They disputed about the rajam, the punishment of the stoning of the idolaters that's in the Old Testament. But there were all of these stories about the disputes between the Jews and the Prophet ﷺ and the Quraysh. So he's saying, well, this would be a gift to them. They couldn't believe something like this would happen. They would definitely exploit it, but they didn't. So that even shows how dubious the tradition is, that it wasn't even circulating at that time because it didn't happen. There would have been no temptation or trial greater than this affliction if it had actually occurred. There would have been nothing which the enemy would have used to provoke dissension more than such an event, if it had been possible to do so, but not a single word of it is related, neither from the recalcitrant nor from any Muslim. This shows that the whole story is false and not to be accepted. And there is no doubt that one of the shaitans of men or jinn foisted this hadith onto one of the heedless people of hadith in order to cause confusion amongst weak Muslims. And this is really the case. I mean, there's no evidence that this even took place. So even the argument that I said in the beginning of the class about what we could learn from the story, we don't need this story to make that lesson. It's just that when somebody mentions it, we talk about the issue of visions. But nobody accepts this hadith. No scholar, whether of Islamic law or hadith or theology, nobody accepts this hadith. It's a completely forged thing, and unfortunately we have things like that. The fourth point is that the people who transmitted this story maintained that Allah's words, quote, they are really near to inviting you from some of what we have revealed to you, hoping you would invent something against us, then they would have taken you as their intimate. This verse was sent down about it. These two verses in fact refute the tradition they have related, because Allah Ta'ala says that they only were very nearly beguiled to make him forget. If it had not been that Allah Ta'ala had made him firm, he would have relied on them. Meaning that this verse negates that the story even happens, because it's saying that it can't happen. The contents of this verse and what is understood from it is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected the Prophet ﷺ from forging a lie and made him firm so that he did not rely on them at all, let alone a lot. They relate in their weak traditions that in addition to the reliance and forgetting, the Prophet ﷺ added praise to their gods, and that he said, I have forged against Allah and said what he did not say. This is contrary to what has been understood from the verse, and would make the hadith weak even if it had been sound. This is similar to what Allah Ta'ala says in another verse, quote, were it not for Allah's favor to you and his mercy, a group of them would have also managed to mislead you, but they misled no one but themselves and do not harm you at all. It is related from Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, all the things about which the Quran says almost or nearly did not occur. That's an important lesson, because many people, for example, they misunderstand the verse of Yusuf alayhi salam. وَلَقَدْ هَمَّ بِهِ وَهَمَّ بِهِ لَوْلَا أَنْ رَأَى بُرْهَانَ رَبِّ. Some people say, oh, he was going to, be seduced by Zulaykha, but Allah says he almost was. So Ibn Abbas, this is like a qa'da. This is one thing that we should remember. Anytime the Quran says almost or nearly, it means it did not happen. That's a principle, okay, a principle understanding. And that's how you can sort of understand language properly. Allah Ta'ala says the brightness of his lightning almost blinds the sight. It does not in fact do so. Allah Ta'ala says also, I nearly conceal it, means he did not do so. Okay, so this is part of the lugha, part of the language of the Quran. This is an important, I'm glad that this is included, this is an important point. Qadi al-Qushayri said that when the Prophet ﷺ passed by their gods, meaning the idols, Quraysh and Thaqif tried to make him look at them and promised him that they would believe in him if he did. He did not and would not do it. Ibn al-Anbari said that the Messenger ﷺ did not go near them nor rely on them. Other tafsir on the meaning of this verse have mentioned what we have mentioned regarding what Allah Ta'ala said about his Messenger ﷺ being protected, which shows that this matter is without basis. All that remains to be learned from this verse is that Allah Ta'ala strengthened his Messenger by protecting him and making him firm regarding what the unbelievers were about to do when they wanted to beguile him. What is meant by this is that the Prophet ﷺ was protected and free from it. This is what should be understood from the verse. And this, by the way, is also another lesson, that people who have false beliefs always want us to acknowledge those false beliefs. So think about that in light of what's happening today in certain different issues, social issues, international issues. Why, for example, on the issue of Palestine, when you talk to a Zionist, why is the first thing that they say, or one of the first things that they say is, does Israel has a right to exist? Do you acknowledge Israel's right to exist? Do you condemn Hamas? Why do they always talk like that? Because there is some kind of false belief that they have to have you agree to. Or if you meet somebody who's gay, what's the first thing that they tell you? I'm gay. What do you think about homosexuality? What does this even have to do with what we're talking about? I remember I was in one of my graduate seminars once, and the guy sat down in class, and the guy, I think we had to like partner or something like that with somebody, and he's like, hi, my name is so-and-so. I'm gay. What do you think of homosexuality? What does this even have to do with class? It has nothing to do with what we're talking. I could care less. It's like me. So you see, I bring this up on purpose because, sometimes I'm silent about these things, but I mean, look at what he's saying. SubhanAllah. Why are they telling him you have to acknowledge the idols? If you acknowledge the idols, we'll believe in you. Because it's based on a false belief that they know that there's a problem with that belief. We don't go around talking with people, do you believe La ilaha illallah? We don't talk to people like that. We talk to people as people. And when they ask us what we believe, well, we believe in this, we believe in that. And they say they don't believe, what do we say? Lakum dinukum waliya din. Okay, that's fine. You believe in what you want to believe. That's what we believe. We're free to believe and respect us, and you're free to believe in what, and we respect you. But you asked. We don't go around doing that because our faith is firm. So I'm using these two examples because they're current, but think about all aspects of life or all things that you're dealing with. You will find that people who have false beliefs will always want you to acknowledge part of their false belief first. And then if so, then they kind of accept you. And remember this story, right? So this is another benefit of why the story is still recorded. Even though the story as a tradition is rejected, we're still talking. Look how much time we've spent talking about it. Now that all of these benefits are from the story. So this is one of them, that people will want you to acknowledge false beliefs or aspects of false beliefs or whatever. Let me just repeat that paragraph. All that remains to be learned from this verse is that Allah Ta'ala strengthened His Messenger ﷺ by protecting him and making him firm regarding what the unbelievers were about to do when they wanted to beguile him. What is meant by that is that the Prophet ﷺ was protected and free from it. This is what should be understood from the verse. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to also make us resilient in light of all of these false beliefs that are out there. The second approach is based on considering the hadith to be sound. So now he's going to posit, like let's say it's sound. In which case the imams of the Muslims have different responses to that of varying strengths. One from Qatada and Muqatil is that the Prophet ﷺ was dozing when reciting the surah, and those words flowed on his tongue as if he were asleep. I mean, already you can see how that's problematic. This should not be valid for the Prophet ﷺ in any of his states, nor would Allah Ta'ala have created that on his tongue, nor could shaitan overcome him. Either while asleep or awake, because the Prophet ﷺ was completely protected. Not only was he completely protected, but he did not sleep the way we slept. He said, أَنَا لَسْتُ كَهَيْئَتِكُمْ إِنِّي أُبِيتُ عَنْدُ اللَّهِ يُطْعِمُنِي وَيَسْقِينِ I am not like you. I spend the evening with my Lord. He gives me sustenance. And he said in another tradition, my eyes sleep, but my heart does not sleep. So he did not sleep the way that we sleep. So him like dozing off and mumbling some like verses of kufr, I mean, that's an impossibility. Al-Kalbi said that the Prophet ﷺ was speaking to himself. Again, all of these are rejected, but he's just going to lay them out for you. Al-Kalbi said that the Prophet ﷺ was speaking to himself when shaitan said that on his tongue. In Ibn Shihab's version from Abu Bakr ibn Abdul Rahman, he said that he forgot when told about it and said that it was from shaitan. All of these things are impossible for the Prophet ﷺ in any state. Shaitan has no power to make him say anything. It is said that perhaps the Prophet ﷺ said it while he was reciting by way of rebuke for the unbelievers in the way that Ibrahim said, this is my Lord, in the verses of the stars. He sees the stars, Hada Rabbi, this was like a rhetorical thing. According to one of the interpretations, and as Ibrahim said, rather the great of them did this. Yani when he knocked down all of the idols, and then he left the large one, he said the large one did, why don't you ask him? Of course, the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, as we mentioned in a previous class, also in the Quran, we reject the interpretation that Ibrahim actually was worshipping the stars or the moon. That was a rhetorical thing because he says in the beginning of the verses that he chides his uncle Azar for worshipping not worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also because we believe in our theology of the Anbiya, that all of the Anbiya are saved and protected in their entire lives. Which is why we also don't say that this was Abraham's father. Because if that was Abraham's father, then that would mean that the line of the prophetic line from Rasulullah ﷺ to Adam ﷺ would have a disbeliever, which contradicts the verses of the Quran that indicate that the Prophet's lineage ﷺ was pure from the beginning to the end. Anyway, returning to this. After a silence and then the clarification of the words, he returned to his recitation. This is possible if the separation was clear and the context indicated what was meant. In this case, what he said was not part of what was recited. This is one of the things that Qadi Abu Bakr has mentioned. There is no argument against this interpretation in what is related about him in the prayer. It is not impossible that the words occurred before the prayer. But I mean, if the tradition is weak to start out with, then there's no reason for an interpretation like this, because the whole story is cast into doubt. That which appears to be true in Qadi Abu Bakr's opinion, and that of others amongst precise people who hold the same opinion regarding the interpretation of this hadith, if indeed it is sound, is that the Prophet ﷺ was reciting the Quran slowly as his Lord had commanded him to, making the verses distinct and precise in his recitation, as has been reliably related about this practice. It was possible that Shaitan was lurking nearby and during the silence slipped in different words which were attuned to the voice of the Prophet ﷺ, so that the unbelievers present thought that the Prophet ﷺ had said them and so publicized them. This is exactly what I said, how the Usulis would deal with this story. As far as the Muslim is concerned, this did not impair the preservation of the surah, which occurred before that incident. As Allah Ta'ala revealed, they were certain about the Prophet's censure of the idols. So this last paragraph, if you're following it's on the bottom of page 304, this is essentially what I was saying in the beginning. If you posit that the story has some weight, then how do you interpret it? And that's what he's saying. The Prophet ﷺ is reciting, and then Shaitan slips in these verses, and then the people hear the two recitations. What's the reason? What's the lesson? Is that what is preserved is the physical appearance of the Prophet ﷺ, and what he says needs to be weighed in the weight of the Sharia. Not that the Prophet ﷺ made a mistake or Shaitan had power over him or something like that. Just a little bit more, and then we'll come to a stopping point. Let me just conclude this discussion. Musa ibn Uqba related something similar in his book, The Raids. I think that means Al-Maghazi, I'm not sure. I think so. Saying that the Muslims did not hear these words. Shaitan cast them into the ears of the idolaters and into their hearts. I mean, Shaitan doesn't have the power to do that. Maybe he said it and they heard it. I mean, the phrasing there is, maybe the translation's a little off. What is related about the Prophet's sorrow, ﷺ, was because of the publicity given to the incident and the uncertainty which made it a cause for trial. Allah Ta'ala says, we did not send any messenger or prophet before you without Shaitan insinuating something into his recitation while he was reciting. Tamanna, that's what's mentioned in the verse. Here means recitation. Allah Ta'ala also says, they know nothing of the book except wishful thinking, that is from its recitation. Allah Ta'ala further says, Allah revokes whatever Shaitan insinuates, meaning takes it away and removes all doubt concerning it and makes the verses clear. It has been said that the verse means that a state of forgetfulness came over the Prophet ﷺ when he was reciting, and then he became conscious of it and returned from it. This is roughly what Al-Kalbi was indicating about the verse when he said that he was speaking to himself, taking when he was fancying to mean was speaking to himself. Something similar to this is related in the transmission of Abu Bakr ibn Abdul Rahman. This forgetfulness in the recitation is valid only if it in no way alters the meaning, changes or verses, or adds something that is not part of the Quran. Here, Qadi Iyad is trying to be nice, but these based on everything I just said, these interpretations are very, very weak. It might constitute omitting a verse or a word of it. However, the Prophet ﷺ never remained in the state of forgetfulness. He can't be forgetful. It's impossible. That's just an impossibility. Then he's not Rasulullah. So that the Prophet, forgetfulness, whatever comes after that is, I reject it. It doesn't make any sense. He was conscious of it and reminded of it immediately, as we will mention when discussing what sort of forgetfulnesses are permitted for him and what are not. Part of what is known regarding the interpretation of this incident is that Mujahid related the story of the high soaring cranes. That's what the pseudo verse is, Al-Gharaniq Al-Ula, the high soaring cranes. So actually they're not called the satanic verses. The satanic verses was popularized by Salman Rushdie in his novel. but they're called Qissatul Gharaniq. For those of you that want to search in the hadith literature, you're going to look for the story of Al-Gharaniq, the high soaring cranes, not the satanic verses. We refer to them as satanic verses for obvious reasons, because our generation, that's what we know them as, but that's not how it's referred to in Islamic literature. If we consider the story to be valid, then we must say that it is not impossible that this is part of the Quran. Well, obviously, it's not part of the Quran. According to this version, what is meant by the high soaring cranes and their intercession being hoped for is that they are angels. This is even worse of an interpretation. Al-Kalbi says that they are angels. The unbelievers used to believe that the idols and the angels were the daughters of Allah Ta'ala. This is refuted by the surah, by the words of Allah Ta'ala, quote, do you have males and he females? Well, let me finish the paragraph and comment. By this, Allah Ta'ala denies their assertion. It is correct to hope for intercession from the angels. When the idolaters interpreted as referring to the gods, Shaitan made it ambiguous to them, decked it out to them in their hearts, and cast that impression into them. Then Allah Ta'ala abrogated what Shaitan cast and made his verse clear, and canceled the recitation of the two phrases which Shaitan had been able to make unclear, in the same way that many of the parts of the Quran were abrogated and the recitation canceled. And this is probably one of the most highly dubious things I've ever read, because this is full of problem on top of problem on top of problem. First of all, the issue about the angels is, how do people end up worshiping other than God? They either are anthropomorphic, which is they ascribe to God human features, and then they bring God close as just like a superhuman, which is basically what a lot of people of claimed faith today are doing. They have you ever heard like a weatherman talk about the weather, and then he's like, the big man upstairs is the one that gave us like the sun, or something stupid like that, right? That's like textbook anthropomorphism 101. You know, Allah is not the big man upstairs, okay? That's because Allah is not a man, and He's not big the way we are big, and He's not upstairs because Allah cannot be confined in any space. So that's one way. The other way is that people will take the angels and they will ascribe to angels special features that are more than what the angels really are, and start worshiping the angels. So in like religions like Zoroastrianism, for example, they have the angel belief in Zoroastrianism is very strong, and maybe too strong. And you can see in that how they've taken the belief of the angels a little bit longer. And then there's the jinn, and people can worship the jinn. So if you, in polytheistic religions, if you analyze them beyond what you see, I mean, you have to just take a moment to think about it and to understand. You will see, you can trace the origin of how these were probably prophets that were worshipped, or they were angels that end up becoming worshipped. That's what he's talking about. That's the reference to the angels. The other thing that he's saying about abrogation, okay, is that there's no this kind of abrogation does not exist in the Quran. Allah is not going to reveal verses praising the false idols and then abrogate. I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean, this contradicts, the whole thing would crumble. All of Islam would crumble if we actually believe that. Which is why this book, by the way, has a lot of compendiums. So I could have just taught this book in a month and just read, but for some reason I decided to do the whole thing. Maybe I should have, but anyway. In the longer version, you're going to have these details. There is wisdom in Allah sending it down, and there is wisdom in its abrogation. Not in this sense. He guides many by it and guides many. He misguides many by it and guides many by it, but He only misguides the degenerate. Allah Ta'ala also says, so that He can make the shaitan insinuate a trial for those with sickness in their hearts, and for those whose hearts are hard, the wrongdoers are across a deep divide. And so that those who have been given knowledge will know it is the truth from your Lord, and believe in it, and their hearts will be humbled by Him. Another explanation is that when the Prophet ﷺ recited the surah and reached the mention of Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Al-Manat, the unbelievers feared he would bring something that censured them, and they preceded him in praising them. Then they mixed them in the recitation of the Prophet and publicized it as their custom. Now that's possible. That the Prophet ﷺ was revealing the verse, he was reciting it, and the Quraysh did not want him to, so they were, no, those are the great gharaniq, and that's possible. And that's another version of shaitan, saying the verses, so it's on their tongue, not on the tongue of the Prophet ﷺ. They said, do not listen to this Quran and talk about it. Drown it out so that perhaps you can gain the upper hand. And some of the Quraysh did that. They would like yell when the Prophet ﷺ would recite the Quran. Some of them would like, I think Abu Lahab would take napkins and put them in his ear. They did weird things like that. So that did happen, and that could be an interpretation. If the story was sound, but the story is not sound to start out with, so we don't have to worry about any of this. This action has been ascribed to Shaitan since he provoked them to do it. They announced the interpolated passage and publicized it, saying that the Prophet ﷺ had said it. He was distressed about it because they had lied and they had forged lies against him. Allah Ta'ala consoled him when he said, we did not send before you. He made it clear that the people of the truth from the false, and the Quran was preserved and its ayat were made exact. He repudiated what the enemy had made obscure, and Allah Ta'ala ensured this with his words, it is we who have sent down the reminder, and we will preserve it. The upshot of all of this is a couple of things before we conclude. Number one is, I want you to see how there are problems, there are problematic things in our intellectual history, and this is how the ulama deal with them. So they don't run away, or they don't say, no, don't ask, that's haram. They deal with it, and they consider, well, what if it's true? What does it mean? What could it mean? And they analyze it. There is nothing that we have that is secret or that the ulama have not commented on. The other thing is about the story itself. Forget about the technicalities that we're dealing with. The bottom line is that nobody from the enemies of Islam at the time capitalized on the story for the very simple reason that it did not happen. And it was not known to happen. And then this is a type of forged tradition that came later. And you better believe it. If this happened, the Quraysh would have been the first to capitalize. That's all they needed is this. And they would have capitalized on it. So that's also a historical thing. Forget about the technicalities. Maybe that eludes some people. What does the chain of transmission mean, and what is that it's weak or sound? Know that, that's one thing that didn't happen. The other thing is, the whole point of this book is for us to have an opportunity to remind ourselves of the status and the stature of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So everything that we've been talking about, we're coming sort of to the end of the book, we can see his greatness, his special qualities, his exalted qualities. Such a story is completely counter to all of the things that we have known about the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Any questions? Well, I think its prominence is, as he said, because historians caught onto it, yeah, and it's so juicy, right? It's not like the other type of forgeries. There are forgeries, of hadith that praise Muawiyah and Yazid, and but people don't even know what that is anymore. So it's like, who are those people? We don't. Maybe I heard something like that, or there are forgeries of. At the time of the Mu'tazilites, to talk about how the Quran is created, but no one understands what that stuff is now. But those come and go. But this has to do with the heart of the prophetic message, which is Tawheed.
But it's amazing. It's the only one that, out of all revelation that came, but they didn't try to come up with all sorts of other stories like this, where we heard somebody say, we heard this, we heard that.
So it's amazing. You mean that this is the one that's lasted?
No, it's amazing that there's only this. Out of all of the times they could have come and said.
Yeah, well, that's another important. You bring up an important point. Is that why aren't there more, doubtful things about Islam? And that kind of shows you, well, that's the robustness of our intellectual histories. That it's very hard to do that because it's so well documented. I was thinking the other day about Quran translations. I was just looking at a Quran translation, and I was thinking, that could have been an opportunity for people to mistranslate and. Yeah, but it's just the Quran is so sophisticated that even that they weren't able to do, and that shows you kind of the resilience of the tradition. Yeah, that's a good point, a very good point. Alhamdulillah. Our problem is us. We are our problem, not people outside it. They're just watching us. The Khilafah? Yeah, I mean, of course, before, before 250, 300 years ago, yani, people could not say stupid things about Islam. Yani, oh, that's true. The ulama were much more prominent, and the ulama used to do ta'zir. Ta'zir is discretionary punishment. So, you can go to a mufti and say something foolish, and the mufti will hit you. And that's why I tell people when they come and talk to me, I say, I believe in ta'zir. I'm just kidding. But discretionary punishment was a thing because of this reason. I mean, there are stories of people, one of Ibn Taymiyyah's followers, I can't remember his name, he was arrested for this bid'ah, and they put him on a donkey backwards and marched him in the town to humiliate him, public humiliation. Sometimes they'll make a man shave half of his beard and walk around like that, to publicly humiliate him. Or shave your beard and, carry like rotten fish and put him on the donkey backwards, and the donkey has a bell. So ding, ding, like everyone sees, like, oh, look at this goof. They did stuff like that. If you said things that were ridiculous, those things would happen. Now, of course, all freedom of speech, and we're sophisticated, and we're a modern democracy and republic, and everyone has the right to do what they want, and it's a different story. That's true. The way society was different, of course.
Here, can you use the microphone so people online can hear you?
So the thing we just mentioned, right? It's not related to what you just said, but while explaining that there are people who, when they go into Ar-Rahman ala al-Arsh istawa, they talk about God's appearance, right?
God's what?
Appearance, and talking about limbs, having limbs, or actually sitting on the throne, which is definitely not the lot of Ahl Sunnah scholars don't agree to this, but we come across these questions a lot, that what is actually the meaning of Ar-Rahman ala al-Arsh istawa then? The second thing about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that when we all believe that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is not a normal human being at all, and he's a prophet, then they always bring this ayah to you, the last ayah of Al-Kahf. I forgot the
قُلْ إِنَّمَا أَنَا
قُلْ إِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشَرٌ مِثْلُكُمْ يُوحَى. So how do we tackle this? What's the best answer to that?
Well, the first thing about the mutashabihat, the verses that are not clear. There are two ways that the people of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah dealt with those verses. One way is to say it means what Allah wants it to mean, but it certainly doesn't mean that Allah has a hand and an eye and Allah's up and Allah sits, and because laysa kamithlihi shay. Laysa kamithlihi shay. The kaf in that verse is extra. Yani the verse could be laysa mithlihi shay. Hada laysa mithli hada. This is not like this. But when Allah adds from the rhetoric of the Quran that extra kaf, laysa ka mithlihi shay, means that Allah is negating that there are even any categories to which Allah Ta'ala could be compared. And I could say my phone is not like your phone, but they're still phones. There's a category that unites them, but this is different than that. There's no category to which Allah can be. So how can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be confined and described by the things that describe us? So this we took from Aristotelian logic. There are called the 10 categories. And the ulama, they put them in a poem form. They say, زيد الطويل الأزرق ابن مالكي كان في بيته بالأمس متكي بيده غصن فلواه فالتوى تلك عشر مقولات سوى. Zayd, the blue man, the son of Malik, was in his house yesterday, leaning. In his hand was a stick, so he bent it and it bent. These are the 10 categories. So these are the 10 things that describe, color, space, matter, location, time. All of these things, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Allah does not have time, location, color, space, smell, reclining, action. Nothing of these are with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the first way that the Ahl Sunnah Jama'ah deal with it is they say that, okay, there's nothing like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second way, that's what we call tanzih, It means what Allah wants it to mean. Like Imam Malik, he said, الاستواء معلوم, الكيف مجهول, والسؤال عنه بدعة. The istiwa, we know it because it's in the Quran. What it means, we don't know, and asking about it is a bid'ah, right? And Imam Malik probably would have hit somebody he was the kind of person that would hit. The second way, the later generation, they did ta'wil. They said, no, it means Allah Ta'ala's mercy manifests upon His creation. There's an explanation so that to answer that question of what it means. But nobody, not one person from Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah says that Allah Ta'ala is in the sky sitting on a chair. When He sits on the chair, it squeaks, and all that's kufr, all that's disbelief. And that's the type of anthropomorphism that the Salaf had to deal with and whatnot. As for the second question, that the Prophet ﷺ is a man, there's no doubt that he's a man. Biologically, he's a man just like us. He was born with mother and son, so on and so forth. But he's not like us because he said, قُلْ إِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشْرٌ مِثْلُكُمْ, in the Quran, say I'm a man like you, يُوحَى إِلَيَّ, but I receive revelation. Do we receive revelation? No, so obviously he's not like us. So, and even in the same verse that they used to argue, is the proof is against him. Do you receive revelation? No. What does receiving revelation look like? What does it feel like? I don't know. The Prophet's chest was cut open like 3-4 times in his life, and his heart, what? Did that happen to you? It didn't happen to me. Did you go up to the 7 levels of the heaven and see Allah and talk with Allah? No. I mean, so okay, I mean, he's a human, but he's not like us. So they say Muhammad basharun kal bashari kal yaquti mithlul hajari, or something like that. Yeah, Muhammad is a man, like all men, just like the ruby is a stone. Would you rather have a ruby, or give your wife a ruby, or give her a pebble from outside? And this is a stone and this is a stone. And so this kind of argument.
We have questions online.
Mm.
So the first question, would it be correct also to say that the first 3 verses of Surah Najm refute the satanic verses story?
Yeah, of course. He does not speak from in huwa wahyun yuha. It is a revelation. And that verse, in huwa illa wahyun yuha, reminds us that also the hadith is protected and a source of revelation, is from revelation. Of course, the hadith is not the Quran, it's something separate, but it is inspired by Allah, instructed by Allah, just like the Quran is. So the Prophet ﷺ, it's not like he brought the Quran and then all of the other things said are his opinion. You can take them or no. No, you have to take what he says because that's a hujjah, it's a proof, just like the Quran is a proof. So also that comes from the first 3 verses of Surah An-Najm.
The next one is more of a comment, I think. Just considering this reminds of the Trinity explanation. So for those looking in, they see what we see. In the nice creed, no. Confusion because it was recorded.
I didn't get that.
Me neither. Okay, this reminds of the Trinity explanation. So for those looking in, they see what we see. In the nice and creed, no, question mark. Confusion because it was recorded.
And the Trinity came later for sure. Even the Christians agreed to that. And the Trinity is not even in the Bible, which is probably the most problematic thing, that their most central creed is not, even supported by the text that they themselves edit. I mean, so yes, and there are monotheistic Christian sects in the beginning, and this is a huge problem in early Christian theology. In the early Christian church, there were many different churches. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why the Copts of Egypt welcomed the Muslims is they said, you can save us from the oppressive Romans, who were also Christian. So the jizya that the Amr ibn al-As told the Muqawqas, the leader of Egypt, that he was asking him to pay, this is much less and much more beneficial than what we were paying the Romans. And the Romans were Christians persecuting other Christians. And during the Crusades, there were crusades against other Christians, not against Muslims. So the theology, Christian theology, is a very problematic thing. There's a very excellent one of the volumes in Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I think it's volume 3 or 4. Essentially, the whole volume is dedicated to explaining. It's very complicated to understand because the theological differences between the different Christian sects is very, very difficult. And sometimes in Latin and in Greek, there's just like one letter or one word difference between this church's theology and this church's theology. And because I don't know Latin and Greek, I mean, I was like, okay, I don't know what that means. But so yes, it is very highly complicated and problematic. And it did come later.
So, about the forgetfulness of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu
what?
alaihi wasallam, forgetfulness, that it's admitted and confirmed that he couldn't forget anything, any ayah, any Quran. But I don't know whether this, my question is related to this, that what about the night, Laylatul Qadr, the exact night of Laylatul Qadr, but when Hazrat Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha asked him about the exact night when Quran was revealed, he was not sure that time. Did he forget that time, or it was...
No, these moments in which you think the Prophet ﷺ would forget, this is the way we understand it, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused this to happen on purpose for the reason of us not knowing. So in the story of Laylatul Qadr, he was going to tell the Sahaba that they started fighting or arguing about something. So it's as if we are saying, Allah Ta'ala told them, okay, don't tell them about Laylatul Qadr. Last class or the class before, we talked about the hadith of Dhul Yadayn, the hadith of the Sahabi his name is Dhul Yadayn, the man with two hands, that the Prophet ﷺ was praying Salat al-Dhuhr or Salat al-Asr, and he prayed 2 rakahs and then he made salam. So Dhul Yadayn, he asked the Prophet ﷺ, أَقَصَرَتِ الصَّلَاةِ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ أَمْ نَسِيتِ? Has the prayer been shortened or did you forget? And the Prophet ﷺ said, كُلُّ ذَلِكَ لَمْ يَكُنْ. None of that happened. And then Dhul Yadayn said, بَعْدَ ذَلِكَ كَانَ. Some of that happened. So the Prophet turned to the Sahaba and he said, أَصَدَقَ Dhul Yadayn? Is Dhul Yadayn being truthful? They said yes. So he stood up and he prayed the 2 rakahs. In this story, the Prophet ﷺ negated that he forgot. And he also negated that the prayer was shortened. What happened? Allah Ta'ala commanded him to pray 2 rakahs so that the Sahaba can see, or we can learn what happens in that situation. That when you forget to pray, you made the mistake in the rakahs and so on. How much speech can you have? Because he stood up and he prayed without a new iqamah or anything. So all of those stories in which we would think that the Prophet ﷺ forgot, we understand them in that light. That he was commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do that or to not say this on purpose to teach us a lesson.
Thank you.
Is there anything else online?
So this is a comment on the previous comment. I think she's saying that Christianity has more problems than Islam because the Trinity became part of established creed, whereas Islam was protected from that kind of issue.
Yes, and the reason is that we have something that no other religious tradition has, which is we have something called al-isnad. We have a chain of transmission. We have a few unique features about Islam. This is one of them. That we have chains of transmission in which the Quran and the Sunnah and all other sciences and disciplines have been transmitted to us through these unbroken chains of transmission. That's how we verify the information. So even something as great as the differences between the Sunni and the Shia, a lot of that is reconciled simply by the chain of transmission. What is the chain of transmission to this story that you are referencing? Is it sound? If it's sound, we accept it. If it's not sound, we don't accept it. And they say the same thing. That's really all, it's as simple as that. So the reason we don't have this type of problem with our theology is the chain of transmission. If something comes in a solid chain of transmission, we accept it and we try to understand it. And then when we find something like this, look, even all of these centuries later, we're still talking about the same story. It has no chain of transmission, it's dubious, it's weak, so on and so forth. And isnad is one of the unique features of Islam. Another unique feature of Islam is the lineage, which is related to the chain of transmission, that people keep their lineage and the family lineage, and our rules about who can marry who, and if you have a wet nurse and you have a brother or sister through wet nursing, and this family relation is also very important. And then the third thing is that we have is the language of Islam, or the Arabic language, and the conjugation, the i'rab of the verbs and the words of the Arabic language that give multiple meanings in a way that other languages don't have. So some of the ulama, they said these are one of the three things that make Islam unique. But definitely the top of that is the chain of transmission. And all of our religion has come to us that way through, I recite and I'm reading you this book, and at the end I'll tell you about the chain of transmission to me to Qadi Iyad. Thousands of people have this chain of transmission, so on and so forth. So nothing that we're saying is that we're making up, and that's how we can verify if what we're saying is true and accurate or not. Sonia.
Just a question about how the Prophet, about how Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he wouldn't sort of like interact with the idols. Is that like then what we're supposed to do if we go to like an interfaith event, or like a Hindu or Buddhist or a church? Like, because when my daughters were younger, we went to a church and they were sort of really, like, I don't want to say scared, but they were really, it seems sort of, I don't know a nice word to use. They were sort of shocked by like the depiction of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam on the cross. So is the reason that you're not supposed to sort of like interact with that or look at that too much is because then the people will think that you're giving that a power? Like, I guess I was confused about that part.
Well, the idolatry at the time of the Prophet ﷺ is different than the idolatry that we have today. First of all, when we talk about other faith traditions, we deal with them as people of the book. So the pure polytheists of Quraysh were not people of the book. It was just pure like idolatry. So it was like a different type of scenario altogether. Okay. And those idols were like inside the Kaaba and outside the Kaaba. There's over 360 of them and whatnot. So that's one important distinction. So this would be like if you were in some remote village in like Asia or Africa or something, and they were like animists, and they actually had like a totem pole or something like that. That would be similar to what the Prophet ﷺ was dealing with. Okay. As far as people of the book, no, we interact with them and we're commanded to interact with them. The Christians of Yemen came and they stayed in the Prophet's mosque, ﷺ, and they prayed in the masjid, and they didn't accept Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ allowed them to stay in the masjid. They spent the night in the masjid, they prayed in the masjid, and they made peace with the Prophet ﷺ. So we have to respect the people of the book, and the people of the book as a category is much larger than just the Jews and the Christians. It's any pre-Islamic organized religion for us are people of the book. So we can interact with them, and interacting with them does not mean that we acknowledge their beliefs or their theology. Interacting with them is the command of the Quran for us to keep good relations with people. So somebody in the community has to do that kind of work, and that's important. Okay. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Allahumma salli afdala salatin ala as'adi makhluqatika Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala آله وصحبه وسلم عدد معلوماتك ومداد كلماتك كلما ذكرك الذاكرون وغفل عن ذكره الغافلون.